The three manifestos. This is a time period of church history that most people know very little about. In fact, I would say that between the 1880s and the 1930s is a time period in church history that was extremely important, and yet it is probably the time period in church history that is written about the least, talked about the least, because it was tumultuous, because it was difficult. And what I'm hoping that I'll be able to lay out for you today is that so often when people hear about the manifesto, they think of the end of polygamy in the church as being an event, a thing that happened, like a single event. But it wasn't. It was a 50-year process of change. And that's kind of the way these things go. As a historian, we're always just looking for new ways to have insight or new ways to add nuance and understanding to these events. And so it's easy enough to look at the church today and look at the church at the time of Brigham Young or John Taylor and say, wow, things have really changed, but not really recognize how did we get from there to here. And so I'm hoping that I'll be able to lay that out in a simple way that will really make this part of church history come alive for you and give it some structure. And that's why I've chosen to call it the three manifestos, so that we can look at these three distinct time periods and how it was that each unique manifesto was to address a different problem and led to a different result. Okay, so there are basically three different stages to the changes that were going on within Mormonism at the time. Now, to set the stage in the 1880s, we're going to be talking about some revelations, particularly the 1886 revelation especially. The 1886 revelation to John Taylor is going to be a great topic of this fireside, because the LDS Church only just recently recognized that revelation. The Church History Library has now made it possible for you to view the original document. I have a photograph coming up in these slides where you can actually take a look at the original handwriting of John Taylor in that revelation. And then that staging, basically what was going on in the church in the 1880s, helps us understand what the three manifestos each did. And here's the basic steps. The first manifesto, or the one that's just simply called the manifesto, was in 1890. And I'm going to lay out that it really only changed one thing. It really only changed the public teaching about plural marriage. It didn't really actually change anyone's practice, which is interesting and surprising to a lot of people to find out that the manifesto of 1890 wasn't the end of plural marriage, but it was the end of the teaching of plural marriage publicly as a doctrine of the church, as a doctrine of exaltation in the church. Those teachings basically stopped. It was a curriculum change, essentially. Second manifesto is in 1904, so it's more than a decade later. That second manifesto, people will sometimes say, oh, well, that one was the end of polygamy in the church. But it really wasn't the end of plural marriage in the church. It was the end of the church officially sanctioning, officially instructing people to enter new plural marriages. And at that point, there started to actually be some consequences for the very first time. The second manifesto period, from 1904 to 1933, or even to 1923, is characterized by the church disciplining or excommunicating or generally making policies that make it very difficult for officiators, in other words, sealers, to perform the sealing ceremony. And so the interesting thing about that time period is, again, it's not the end of plural marriages, it's the end of officiators performing those new plural marriages with the full imprimatur of the church's cooperation. That the church at the highest levels was encouraging this or sanctioning it or being fully involved in it. But the marriages were still there, right? And being a polygamist wasn't frowned upon by the church as though it was a bad thing, right? It still wasn't a sin from anybody's point of view. A lot of people were polygamists at that time period. It was officiating a new ceremony that was the problem. And then the third step, the third manifesto came out in 1933. At that point was the beginning of actual members being excommunicated for living plural marriage. That was the first time it became a problem to believe in it. It became a problem to practice it, especially openly. And that, therefore, really, the 1930s is actually the beginning of the separation between the mainstream LDS Church and Mormon fundamentalists. And that divergence doesn't really occur until 1933, almost 50 years after some of these revelations to John Taylor. We're finally seeing a real split at that point. And then, of course, there's an aftermath. After that, it takes another 50 years or so before plural marriage truly and completely stops being practiced inside the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And these organizations are fully separated. So I want to go over some of the personalities that are going to be in the stories that I'm going to tell you. The four individuals up here were all members of the First Presidency at different times. And they each played an interesting role in this, right? John Taylor is the one who received the revelations. Then the First Presidency of Heber J. Grant, Anthony Ivins, and J. Reuben Clark are the ones who enforce and then later issue the third manifesto, enforce the second manifesto, and then eventually issue the third manifesto. And I just want to make an aside here. I was really fascinated, especially by Anthony W. Ivins in this. President Ivins was on both sides of this to such an extreme, more than anyone else, right? He personally performed hundreds and hundreds of new plural marriages after the manifesto, but he also was a signatory on the third manifesto, excommunicating people for doing the things he himself did. And so, again, you're going to see this kind of tension. And so he's a really enigmatic character in that sense, because here he is 100% saying the church has to do this, regardless of the consequences to anybody else. We have to excommunicate anybody we have to excommunicate. We have to put it into this plural marriage stuff, even while he spent decades promoting post-manifesto polygamy, making a point of perpetuating it at all costs, even against the church and against the church's instructions. So I think what's happening really is that there's this tension arises because people want to do what's right, and they're being pulled in two different directions. What's right to save the church from the persecution of the law, persecution of the Gentiles, is to try to stop plural marriage, because that's what was bringing the persecution. But the thing to do right by God is to recognize these revelations and to obey them, right? And he wants to do both. He wants to have his cake and eat it too. And I think that a lot of these leaders during this 50-year time period exhibit that same impulse. So I think I want you to just take that brief overview and familiarize yourself with these characters. Now, those were members of the First Presidency. We also have some other characters who were apostles, either in the Quorum of the 12 actively, or were ordained outside of the Quorum of the 12. But each of them have an interesting role to play. John W. Taylor's especially worth mentioning, because John W. Taylor is the son of John Taylor, the prophet, and he was instrumental in promoting and bringing out the 1886 Revelation, which we now have cataloged in the church. And later on, I'm going to be telling you about how you can get your own copy, either in the comments. We're going to put a link as well, and in the chat. Or further down in the presentation, you're going to see a link where you can download them or order paper copies for your scriptures. In fact, for every copy of the quad you've got in your possession, I'm hoping that you will be able to order an addendum to the Doctrine and Covenants that you can slip right in there and expand your scriptures. So here's some of the important characters there that got excommunicated. And it's interesting that this is basically all in the second manifesto period that these apostles get excommunicated. John W. Taylor was one of the first. He was excommunicated in 1911. One of the very first people ever excommunicated for plural marriage. And that's more than 2 decades after the manifesto. So that's an interesting point, right? Being actively involved in promoting, teaching, performing plural marriages, entering new plural marriages And John W. Taylor is one of the very first people to be excommunicated, and it's been more than 20 years before they actually start excommunicating anybody for continuing plural marriage. John Woolley was then excommunicated in 1914. He especially stood out to me actually for a different reason than he did to most. It was the fact that he was performing new plural marriages in the Salt Lake Temple as a sealer there for years that got them quite upset with him because it was so high profile. He was being bold about these beliefs, and the Salt Lake Tribune, of course, was latching on to these things. In fact, the Salt Lake Tribune listed Joseph Musser as one of the people who'd entered a new post-manifesto plural marriage, and they chose to take no action against him. The Quorum of the 12 held a trial for Joseph Musser and said, no, we're not going to excommunicate him. And it wasn't until after the death of Joseph F. Smith in 1921 that he was finally excommunicated in a different trial. And then Loren Woolley, he's a very important figure to most Mormon fundamentalists because he became a very prominent leader in the Mormon fundamentalist movement. And once again, he was excommunicated. And the difference is that for him, it was mostly because he was publicly explaining about all of the plural marriage that was happening. And by doing so, the church felt that they were embarrassed. And they also felt that they were going to get in trouble with Loren Woolley out there saying, well, look, the Quorum of the 12 and the First Presidency, they have all these plural marriages after the manifesto. Obviously, the manifesto shouldn't be taken very seriously, he was arguing. And they thought, oh my goodness, we can't have that because the manifesto of 1890 and 1904 is the only thing protecting us from further legal persecution. So they didn't want him running around saying that. So those are a few more of these characters, and they're going to come up. Now, let's set the stage. There's a time period in the 1880s, is more or less the start of it. It could go a little earlier, but I generally would say that what's called the Mormon underground period doesn't really start until 1882 at the earliest, but probably closer to 1886. John Taylor in 1885 gives his last public address in a general conference, and that's where the quote comes from here, because he's saying that he will stand up for what is right, regardless of what anybody else can do. And sure enough, they did try. You'll see there we have a wanted poster. John Taylor and George Buchanan had Price on their head, right? In order to stand up for Mormonism, it was so bad. This wasn't just, oh, there's some law, it's a little bit of an annoyance, I guess we'll have to give up plural marriage kind of situation, the way it's generally portrayed by a lot of historians. This was a time period of extreme danger and persecution. And so why it's called the Mormon Underground is because all these church leaders have to go into hiding. George Buchanan even does end up getting arrested at one point. A lot of them go from house to house. They hide in different places. Some of them head to Mexico, or at least as far as Arizona, some of them to Canada, trying to evade capture, trying to evade being imprisoned for their faith. And therefore, all the church leadership, which were basically all plurally married, every stake presidency, every high council, every general authority was plurally married. In fact, another revelation in the collection that I want to share with you is actually from the Lord spoke to John Taylor in 1882, and that's why I'm saying maybe that's the earlier date that we could place the beginning of the Mormon Underground, saying that essentially all the leaders of the church needed to conform to the law of plural marriage, and calling on each of them to do so. So at that time, basically the entire leadership of the church goes underground. And that leads to the interesting thing. This underground means that there is a public face of the church, a public doctrines, public expressions, and then there's private ones. And they start separating those two things. Private doctrine, private practice, and public doctrine and public practice become completely separated, so that they can hide from this persecution of the law. Now, what law are we talking about? The Edmunds Act and then the Edmunds-Tucker Act, 1882, 1885, and 1887. There's a couple different acts here from Senator Edmunds and Senator Tucker, and that's their pictures there. But in these acts from Congress, because from Washington, D.C., the territories are governed not by the local, like we have with the state, right, where we have our own state legislatures. Territories are governed by the federal Senate, right, the guys in Washington, D.C. And they have some really, really heinous laws that they pass, right? It does things like disincorporate the church, disenfranchise all the church members, end the right to vote, seizes all church assets. This becomes really important. Wilford Woodruff explains later, one of the things he was concerned about is the fact that the church could not own property, and therefore the church could not own the temples. The temples themselves were owned by the federal government, and they created a couple of like lease compromises where the temples wouldn't be torn down and would be leased to church members for local church members for like $1 a year until they could sort out what the final disposition of the church was supposed to be. In other words, their goal was to abolish all Mormonism until it dies out completely, and there would be no Mormons, and then the federal government could demolish the buildings and everyone could move on from this terrible thing called Mormonism. So what was it? I know it sounds extreme, but it's basically this genocidal impulse to wipe out the entire people, to wipe out their faith, their entire community, right? And so that was the environment that John Taylor was in. As president of the church, he wasn't the president of an organization recognized by the law. Quite the opposite. He was the head of an organization that was illegal. And he was running from those laws, trying to do whatever he could to save his people. And so, to set that stage, John Taylor is in some really tough straits. And what does a true prophet of God do when he needs counsel, when he needs wisdom, when he needs to know how to lead the people? Well, he should ask of God, and he does. So John Taylor prays and asks the Lord what to do. Now, there's a whole lot more that goes into the context here, and I've given other firesides on the details there. But I think for today, our purposes are best served if I simply read the revelation itself. Okay, maybe I'll just read the intro here to give some context. This revelation was given to John Taylor in Centerville, Utah, on the 27th of September, 1886. During this time, the First Presidency and Quorum of the 12 were in hiding due to the persecution regarding the principle of celestial marriage and their defiance of all the federal laws which had unincorporated the church and made their marriages illegal. Beginning in May or June of 1886, letters began to come to President John Taylor from various leaders of the church who were also in hiding, asking him to do something to satisfy the law, because the Utah Commission was confiscating all of their property in connection with the property of the church. So George Buchanan suggested that President Taylor take the matter up with the Lord and decide the next day if some statement or manifesto could be adopted to satisfy the demands of the law. President Taylor replied, "Do you think that I would decide on such a matter without taking to the Lord and get his decision and final word on the matter?" So accordingly, President Taylor inquired of the Lord on the evening of September 26th, and the next day we have recorded this revelation. So here's the actual revelation from the Lord to John Taylor, as John Taylor prayed. "My son John, you have asked me concerning the new and everlasting covenant, how far it is binding upon my people. Thus saith the Lord, all commandments that I give must be obeyed by those calling themselves by my name, unless they are revoked by me or by my authority. And how can I revoke an everlasting covenant? For I, the Lord, am everlasting, and my everlasting covenants cannot be abrogated nor done away with, but they stand forever. Have I not given my word in great plainness on this subject? And yet have not great numbers of my people been negligent in the observance of my law and the keeping of my commandment? And yet I have borne with them these many years, and this because of their weakness, because of the perilous times. And further, it is more pleasing unto me that men should use their free agency in these matters. Nevertheless, I, the Lord, do not change, and my word and my covenants and my law do not. And as I have heretofore said by my servant Joseph, all those who would enter into my glory must and shall obey my law. And have I not commanded men that if they were Abraham's seed and would enter into my glory, they must do the works of Abraham? I have not revoked this law, nor will I, for it is everlasting, and those who will enter into my glory must obey the conditions thereof. Even so, amen. And so this sets the stage for why the manifestos are going to be so difficult. John Taylor has established to him, really, in this revelation from God, that he is to hold firm to the principles of the gospel no matter what. Because the same way the Lord doesn't change, our obedience to his commandments cannot change. And the document you see here on the screen is the actual handwriting of John Taylor. We have very few of these, by the way. Very, very few passages of any scripture are available in the form of what is called an autograph. Not just a signature, but an autograph meaning handwritten original. The handwritten original that was the very first source of all the text itself. Joseph Smith usually used scribes. We don't have the gold plates to refer to for the Book of Mormon. We don't even have the entire printer's manuscript of the Book of Mormon. But here we have John Taylor's own handwriting, that he received these words from the Lord. And to me, it's a beautiful testament of comfort in a time of great distress and resilience in the face of that distress to say, just as the Lord is unchanging, let us be unchanging in keeping his holy commandments. But he can't say this publicly, so he says it privately. And this is what sets the stage for the beginning of Mormon fundamentalism, because there's this divide between what is publicly acceptable to do and what the private convictions are of all those who receive this. Now, along with this revelation is a story that night, as John Taylor prayed, the resurrected Lord, Jesus Christ, appeared to John Taylor and gave him these instructions. And that Joseph Smith appeared and gave further instructions as well about preserving the priesthood. This has led to the claim that some of these men received a special commission that they were to continue living plural marriage. And I've heard this from many, many people, including the people who never claimed to even be ordained, that it was very clear that John Taylor, on several occasions, as well as this one, put everyone present under covenant to keep the commandments come what may. And that is why it becomes the origin story that Mormon fundamentalists tell. Now, the first manifesto comes only 4 years later. John Taylor has passed away at that time. And Wilford Woodruff is the president of the church. And Wilford Woodruff is placed in this situation where they're saying, okay, well, we don't have to worry about catching John Taylor and throwing him in prison anymore. We can throw you in prison. And maybe instead of leasing the temples back for $1 a year, maybe we'll tear them all down. And so Wilford Woodruff is in a really tight spot, and he issues a manifesto. Now, the interesting thing is there's a big difference between what the manifesto says and what the manifesto does. What it says, of course, is this is the end of plural marriage. And that is why many people view the end of plural marriage in the church as a singular event that occurred on October 6th, 1890. But, of course, history is always more complicated than that. It said we're going to stop practicing it, but it also, there's a quote from it, basically, it also said that we're going to stop teaching it. That's the only part that they actually do. They do stop teaching plural marriage, but they don't stop practicing it. And so what didn't it do? It actually didn't stop the practice of plural marriage, but it drove it further underground. That Mormon underground period that was already happening just continues. And the public statements and the private actions become even more separated out, where private actions and public statements are less and less in agreement. Wilford Woodruff himself is said to have entered another plural marriage even after the manifesto that he himself issued. And so, regardless of how it's been interpreted over the years, the manifesto clearly didn't mean to President Wilford Woodruff what it's generally assumed it means, which is that there would be no more practice of plural marriage when he's even entering new plural marriages after that fact. And I thought this quote from Lorenzo Snow was also quite interesting. After Wilford Woodruff dies, Lorenzo Snow becomes president of the church, And he says that he would not want to interfere with President Cannon's work. President Cannon being one of the people who was commissioned to keep plural marriage alive, regardless of what the church or anyone else should do, during that meeting in 1886. So it continues. Now, that's basically what happened between the first and second manifesto. When's the second manifesto? Second manifesto happens in 1904. We've got a little pencil drawing here, or copper plate, that shows what it was like during the Smoot hearings. Now, the Smoot hearings, Reed Smoot, that's the fellow in the bottom corner, he was a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, and he was elected to be senator from Utah. When he was elected, he went to Washington, D.C., and said, I've been elected senator from the state of Utah, and the Senate was pretty upset. They were saying, wait a second, it was only a few decades ago that we said that Mormons couldn't hold public office, that Mormons could not vote, that all these things had happened. Now, there had been some amnesties in the meantime, but they were still very concerned about seating a senator who was a Mormon. And they wanted to answer that question for themselves. Can you be a Mormon and be an American? At that time, as you'll see, sitting in this chair is Joseph F. Smith, drawing of Joseph F. Smith. They bring him in and they grill him for 3 days. And basically the hypocrisy of having private actions in favor of plural marriage and public statements against it, that's not very acceptable to the Senate when it comes down to it. And that is the situation that Joseph F. Smith found himself in. Saying, yes, privately, of course I'm a polygamist. Privately, I encourage these things. Privately, I practice these things. But publicly, we disavow it. Isn't that good enough? And it was not good enough for the Senate. They were very upset. So they put the pressure on the church and they say, you have to issue another manifesto because we don't believe the first one anymore. You have to issue another one. And so he issues, it's called the Second Manifesto that year in 1904, and it says something that the first one did not. It actually says, it puts some teeth to it. It says that people can be excommunicated. There's a quote here from there. It says, if any member, officer, or member of the church shall assume to solemnize or enter into any such marriage, he'll be deemed in transgression against the church, will be liable to be dealt with according to the rules and regulations thereof, and excommunicated therefrom. And interestingly, in 1904, they issue this as a political statement, but what happens? Absolutely nothing happens, at least at first. However, by 1909, something does begin to happen. Francis Lyman and Heber J. Grant organize a committee to try to excommunicate people who officiate new plural marriages. Now, interestingly enough, the 1904 manifesto, just like the 1890 manifesto, insinuated that regular members probably shouldn't be doing this either. But there was still no actual enforcement against any of them. And it isn't until 1909 that a few of the members of the Quorum of the 12 start looking at excommunicating the other members of the Quorum of the 12. Because, again, there's this divide. Some of them are very public-facing, like Reed Smoot. He was a senator. He wants the public face of the church to be respected. And that, at the time, was necessary for them to be fighting against plural marriage. And disavowing it in order to have that public respect. But privately, you have other apostles who are like, we don't care about politics. John W. Taylor famously says at his excommunication trial, he says, I would rather find myself on the side of the Lord than on the side of politics. Which, of course, exacerbates Francis Lyman, Heber J. Grant, and Reed Smoot. They're just absolutely flummoxed because they do care about politics and they don't want members of the Quorum of the 12 saying, who cares about politics, right? And so that's when that starts to happen. There's also Matthias F. Cowley. The three pictures you're seeing here are Matthias F. Cowley. His is the more yellowed out picture. Matthias F. Cowley is dropped from the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. The fellow at the bottom is John W. Taylor again. He is dropped from the Quorum of the 12 and excommunicated. And the one in the top right, that is Francis Lyman, who was assumed would be the president of the church soon because he was president of the Quorum of the 12 and next in seniority after Joseph F. Smith. But Interestingly enough, and fairly unexpectedly, he dies just before Joseph F. Smith does, and so doesn't become the president of the church. Instead, it falls to his next right-hand man, which is Heber J. Grant. Would be the next one in seniority, at least of the ones that weren't excommunicated at that point. So at this point, with the Second Manifesto, period, what's really happening is that it starts to become a liability to be in a plural marriage. During the time of John Taylor in the 1880s, right, it's an absolute requirement. You cannot serve in a stake presidency without being plurally married. You cannot be a general authority without being plurally married. You cannot preside in those things without conforming to the law of plural marriage. But during the Second Manifesto period, it turns entirely on its head. Francis Lyman's committee succeeds at issuing a few other policy documents in, 1914? And they basically change the requirement. Instead of it being a requirement that you have to be plurally married, you might not be disciplined for being plurally married, but you can no longer serve as a general authority. You can no longer serve in a stake presidency, high council, bishopric. And so over that time period from 1904, 1909 really, until 1920 or so, that decade and a half, the entire leadership of the church gets turned over. There's no institutional memory. There's no institutional continuity. Every single high council, stake presidency, bishopric, general authority gets replaced. All of them. And Joseph F. Smith is presiding over that, which really is an interesting question. What was Joseph F. Smith doing during this time, right? He's the president of the church, and it's hard. Is Joseph F. Smith a Mormon fundamentalist, loyal to these original principles, or is he one of the moderns who's trying to make these changes? And the funny thing is that he's kind of both. And his statements are all over the place. I really appreciated something that historian Mike Quinn said. He said, there were two great animating motives behind everything Joseph F. Smith did. First, to protect the church at all costs, and second, to perpetuate plural marriage. These conflicting impulses shaped him into a confounding figure. And I think that the reason why that was such a surprising thing is because, again, you have this big public versus private divide. In public, Joseph F. Smith is doing whatever he can to protect the church. Even lie. I mean, frankly, I think even lie. But in private, he's encouraging all of these people who have received the commission to continue practicing, living, and performing plural marriages to continue doing it. He even performs John W. Woolley's marriage in the Salt Lake Temple in 1910, just 1 year before John W. Woolley gets excommunicated. He personally performs it. So he's trying to create plausible deniability. While he says in public one thing, while in private, he encourages something else. And again, that's kind of the difficult nature of what's called the Mormon underground period that's going on at this time, is just that public statements and private actions that just don't match. And I know that feels like hypocrisy, or it feels like lying to a lot of people. But I like to point out, I think it's necessary to point out, these men were under threat of death. These men were under threats to their lives, their children, their livelihoods, the destruction of the temples, and everything that they felt they had a stewardship over to protect. And in such circumstances, who wouldn't do whatever it took to save their children, to protect their families, right? And if that looks a little bit like hypocrisy to people now, I would encourage you to have a little bit of patience and grace for the difficult circumstances they were in. Much like any minority who's being institutionally persecuted by an unjust or authoritarian regime in the world today. So what was the result? What was the result of this two-faced policy? What was the result of having private and public be so divergent? Well, mostly it slowed down, but it didn't stop. From 1904 to 1923, the number of new plural marriages declined quite a bit, but there were still a few dozen every year. And even excommunication then proved ineffective. And this is the thing that's surprising, is that yes, at this point, people are learning to be extremely private about their family life. They're learning to lie essentially and not tell people what's going on in their lives. But and most of them leave church leadership at that point, leave public life, and they retreat into a more private setting with their plural families. But even excommunicating people for officiating these marriages doesn't actually stop anybody. And don't forget, imagine how hard this is. What if someone were to tell you, oh no, you have to get rid of some of your children, or you have to divorce your wife because the church says so? Of course, or the law says so. Very few people are going to obey such a horrible command. Very few people are going to obey that kind of thing. And so they excommunicated a bunch of leaders. But you know what they didn't do? I've not found any evidence that anyone was excommunicated for believing in plural marriage during this time period. I haven't found anybody who was excommunicated for simply being in a plural marriage. Particularly, I've never found any evidence that any woman was ever excommunicated. Now, some of them were questioned. Who's the father of your child? Are you in a plural marriage? Who performed that marriage? And there were women who refused to cooperate, or who hid their pregnancies, or who hid these things. And so some of them were called on the carpet, so to speak. But after those trials, not one of them was actually excommunicated. Because they were really not trying to excommunicate all the members of the church who lived plural marriage, which was, frankly, probably half of the church still lived in plural households. Even some of our oldest general authorities in the mainstream LDS Church today grew up with parents or grandparents who were in these plural marriages. So they weren't trying to excommunicate them. They were just trying to find out who's instigating this and who's performing the marriages, and can we get them to stop, right? So I hope that is useful. Now, this leads us to the time period of Heber J. Grant, and this is what's going to lead us from this second manifesto period into the third manifesto period. And to set the stage, Heber J. Grant actually has some very difficult things he's just inherited. Okay, at the time of him, Heber J. Grant assuming leadership of the church, because Joseph F. Smith is now dead, he's handed a very complicated problem. You see, the church still doesn't have a legal legitimacy. The church still doesn't have legal recognition and cannot own any property, which means the church, that organization does not have legal existence, it doesn't have property, it doesn't have anything. Heber J. Grant wants to fix this. He wants to build a situation where Mormons can then again cooperate and be part of American society again, right? So in order to do that, he cannot revive the old church organization. He has to make a new one. In 1923, he incorporates a new religious organization called the Corporation of the First Presidency. Corporation of the First Presidency, even today, owns a trademark to the logo of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But even now, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is not a recognized religious institution. It's the Corporation of the First Presidency that is established by Heber J. Grant. And then that organization, that new corporation, is going to try to prove its bona fides, that it is the legitimate continuation of the church that existed under Brigham Young and John Taylor and Wilford Woodruff and those guys, because he has to prove that he's in control now, that there isn't plural marriage going on, and that it's safe for the federal government to start selling these assets back to a religious organization that's allowed to exist now. Because I think at this time, right, they've already gone through about 40 years of trying to abolish Mormonism completely, and obviously the feds are not going to be able to follow through on that. They're not trying to do that hardcore anymore. And the church can't even stop their own members from being polygamists, for goodness sakes. They're certainly not going to be able to wipe out the Mormons and have them not exist as a people. And so what he needs to do is reorganize it, reorganize that church on a legal basis at least, so that he can own these properties. Now, what's he going to do? He is going to ask his lawyer for help. And this is one of the places that I learned a few new things and that really surprised me. J. Reuben Clark. So Heber J. Grant asked his attorney for help. J. Reuben Clark, I was surprised to find out, was a politician of sorts. He served in a couple of different administrations in Washington, D.C. He was a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. And of course, that's why Heber J. Grant hired him. He hired him because he needed somebody who could represent the church with all of this conflict that they had with the government. And I knew that he was a member of the First Presidency, but what really surprised me to find out was in April of 1933, J. Reuben Clark was made a counselor in the First Presidency, in spite of the fact that he had never actually been ordained or served in any leadership capacity for the church. Now, he did, for a very short period of time, help with some curriculum for the Young Men's Mutual Improvement Association. But essentially, he is just the lawyer of the First Presidency, and he's just made a member of the First Presidency. And even when he joins the First Presidency, he's still not ordained to an office. He's still not given any keys or authority or anything like that. But he assumes almost all of the administrative and legal tasks necessary for this new church organization to be formed well. Because that decade from 1923 to 1933, Heber J. Grant met with some success, but also with a great deal of difficulty in trying to, obtain the church assets and organize the church. And so J. Reuben Clark joins the First Presidency, and he hits the ground running. He takes immediate action. That year, in 1933, it's only a couple months later that they issue the Third Manifesto, written by J. Reuben Clark. That same year, they also passed the very first Utah state law criminalizing plural marriage. Now, that's the interesting thing. I already told you about the Edmunds-Tucker Act, but that's a federal law, and it has no authority in the states. As soon as Utah becomes a state in 1896, polygamy stops being a crime in Utah. There is no criminal punishment. Only a clause in the Utah State Constitution that says plural marriages are not going to be recognized legally. That doesn't mean it's criminal behavior to do it. It just means you can't get a marriage license, right? You can't get the stamp of approval from the government that says your marriage is legitimate. But if you are cohabitating, if you have your own private religious beliefs, that's not the government's business in Utah, and it's not a crime. But J. Reuben Clark clearly needs to shore up the bona fides of the church. He needs to make sure that it's clear that it's not these other church leaders that are the true leaders. We're the real leaders. And so he has to get rid of any rival to that authority. And that's one of the reasons why I find it so just amazing and almost confounding that here he is doing everything he can to prove the legal legitimacy of this new version of the LDS Church. He's obsessed with doing that, to the point that they literally overlook the fact that he hasn't been ordained, which is just shocking, right? You'd think that they would at least have done some of the priesthood things to show his legitimacy as well as the legal things. But really, the focus is entirely outward to the world to prove that this organization is an American organization, that it can hold property, that it can be trusted, that it's on a firm legal footing. And so that's J. Reuben Clark's job, and that's what he does that year. Now, here we have the actual cover of the Third Manifesto. It's called an official statement. It's probably worth pointing out at this point, the church never used the term manifesto officially. Even the manifesto, the first manifesto, is simply called an official statement, right? And it's called an official declaration, as the church publishes it now at the end of the Doctrine and Covenants, just after the last revelations there. They publish it as official declaration rather than as a manifesto or revelation. That is just a term that grew over time, right? So even the Third Manifesto doesn't use the word manifesto. It's simply just an official statement of the First Presidency. Now, this is what really actually makes that divide between public and private. That was all existing within the church. At this point, you're going to see a real schism, which I would call the second great schism of the church. Now, why do I call it that? There was the great schism, or the first great schism of the church, is at the death of Joseph Smith. That's where the reorganized church comes from, the Strangites, and then, of course, Rigdon, Hedrick, Fettingites, all of these other groups, Cutlerites, come out of that first great schism. When Joseph Smith dies, Not everyone follows Brigham Young. And so there's a bunch of other churches that form. The third manifesto really creates a second great schism, and that is the beginning of all Mormon fundamentalist churches, including, to some extent, Christ Church, ours, is viewed as separate primarily because at this time period, there gets to be the point where it's an actual break, a clear break between two different organizations. And yet, this is very problematic history because, unfortunately, the Third Manifesto isn't just a new and stronger statement that says the church is going to be separating itself from these former leaders, from these other apostles, from these other people, and being a separate organization. It's actually instead filled with heinous accusations and intentional misstatements that are now historically provable to be misstatements, intentional misstatements. And I think this is really what kicks off and what causes a lot of cognitive dissonance for a lot of Mormon people, is that they'll say, wait a second, I was told the history was one way, and it turns out that it's a different way. And I feel like this was also really the beginning of some of that, because the public statement just didn't match the facts. So here's one example from the Third Manifesto that I want to read, because it refers to that revelation where we started out from John Taylor. When John Taylor received that revelation from the Lord, they denied that even occurred, or that the piece of paper even existed. So I'll just read a little bit of the Third Manifesto here. He says, "It is alleged that on September 26th to 27th, 1886, President John Taylor received a revelation from the Lord, the purported text of which is given in publications, circulating apparently by or at the instance of this same organization. As to this pretended revelation, it should be said that the archives of the church contain no such revelation. The archives contain no record of any such revelation, nor any evidence justifying a belief that any such revelation was ever given. From the personal knowledge of some of us, from the uniform and common recollection of the presiding quorums of the church, from the absence in the church archives of any evidence whatsoever justifying any belief that such a revelation was given, we are justified in affirming that no such revelation exists." And this was difficult because oh my goodness, that is really strong language. They've really, really painted themselves into a corner here, right? They're saying that the piece of paper doesn't even exist, whether or not it's legitimate. And yet, in the archives of the church, at the time, the original document was there, copies were there that had been made in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. There were records about all of these things having occurred, right? Extensive information about it having occurred. Now, just about a month ago, what was originally a secret dossier by J. Reuben Clark was released. When the Church History Library released the original document itself that I showed you earlier of the 1886 revelation, they also released various other copies that were in the church archives and records about them that had been in the church archives well before this statement, but also this piece of paper signed by J. Reuben Clark, where he basically acknowledges that, yes, of course this is real, and yet he reads that statement, that false statement, in the next General Conference anyway. And so we know that J. Reuben Clark knew that what he was saying was not factual, that it wasn't true. But why does it matter? Why did he do what he did? I think he had some pretty understandable reasons. And again, it might give some of us pause to wonder, what would we do in such a situation? Because he needed to keep the church on this firm legal basis that he was building. And in order to do that, he had to make very firm statements that would separate the church from fundamentalism. And that, it was the effect. The Third Manifesto actually began systematic excommunications at every level of the church against every person that would not affirm that statement, even though it was known to be false. And that was one of the things that was difficult, is that lots of individuals who were present, who had read this revelation, who had copies of this revelation, were being told that unless they disavowed belief that revelation even existed, that they could be excommunicated. And the Third Manifesto added even more teeth to the idea when it said at the end, "We shall hold church officers responsible for the proper performance of this duty." In other words, The first presidency was saying, we will excommunicate every bishop and stake president who does not excommunicate all the polygamists. Now, there were still polygamists in the church up until the 1970s, but they certainly weren't out there saying what they knew about these revelations, because there was an official church line that could not be contradicted, even though there were people who remembered from firsthand experience that some of those statements were not true. And so this divide between public policies and private actions after 1933 leads to these two different organizations. In public, everyone needed to affirm this new history. Privately, people may continue to live in plural families, but if they became too vocal, then they would be cut off. And so really, this is an interfamily conflict, a difficult conflict. One of the little bits of trivia I find fascinating is that Spencer W. Woolley, Spencer W. Kimball, the W stands for Woolley. Spencer Woolley Kimball, as president of the church all the way up until the 1980s, right? He's the nephew of John Woolley, who's perpetuating plural marriage. So this is in their own families, right? And it really, over time, the lines of communication, the attendance at one another's meetings really just breaks down slowly over this time period. One of them that I'm intending to write more about in the future, because it was really fascinating to me, was meetings where Joseph Musser and Joseph Fielding Smith both attended the same meetings, and they had conversations, and then later they had correspondence about whether or not one presided over the other. Who was in charge here? And Joseph Fielding Smith said, well, I'm the president of the church. And Joseph Musser said, but I'm the president of the priesthood. And they were still having conversations about who is the real leader here. But that really breaks down until by the time you're in the 70s or so, it's these two organizations become completely separated. And private church councils and public church leadership completely diverge. David Patrick, I'm wondering if any comments or questions have come up so far in this presentation that you like to chime in with.
All right. It doesn't look like we have a whole lot of questions, but let's show people how to get a copy of the addendum, and I'll share my screen for a second.
I'm willing to do that. I have a later on thing about it. Here we go.
Oh, okay. Oh, good.
I
Well, let's
I,
do that
I, I
then.
do have some more presentation before I was going to get to it, but
Yeah, we can get
yes,
to it then. Let's
this
just
is
hold
useful.
back until then.
All right. But yeah, if you want to copy that that link real quick, that is how you can get a copy. But let's go back. All right. So here is my summation. The three manifestos give you a very simple way of remembering what happened during this time period. Okay? First, they had to stop the teachings. Then they had to replace the leadership. And then they had to expel anyone who wasn't on board, right? And that's why three different manifestos each made an incremental step to this schism, to these changes. And I think it's useful to use these three manifestos as a basic tool to understand what was going on in each of these time periods. And another way of looking at it, of course, is just stages of change, right? The public teachings change, then the officiators or the officers change, and last, the membership itself changes because many members are excommunicated. It's interesting for me to note, too, in the 1930s is when the LDS Church reached 1 million members for the first time, 1 million members. And there are approximately 100,000 Mormon fundamentalists, meaning that it was roughly a tithe, roughly 10% of the church was expelled from the church. And that's still a substantial amount today. And this is why that aftermath is so interesting to me. Now, There's another set of ways of looking at this that that can be more positive. Okay, these historical facts which have come to light, which we can now are now demonstrated and even recognized by the LDS Church History Department, is really a relief, I think, to present day fundamentalists, because we can take a look at this and say, okay, now that we know the facts, maybe we don't agree on what they mean, okay? But we now know that it wasn't just a few randos, so to speak, a few random individuals who were radicals that left the church. This is there are multiple lines of authority by numerous leaders to perpetuate plural marriage. We have this revelation in John Taylor's own handwriting that we know is from him. Every expert agrees now, including the church. And in our case, in Christ's church, we believe that the church and the priesthood can come together again and no longer have a division between this private practice and public statement, but that we can fully embrace all of the Lord's commandments today, and that we can fully live and accept all of the Lord's revelations without that conflict of what about the church versus what about the priesthood that plagued Mormon fundamentalists for that 50-year period. We're now in a period where we believe that you can openly and courageously live the gospel of Jesus Christ, and as the prophet Paul said, not be ashamed. And so the question I would have to ask about the three manifestos and this revelation, which is better, to obey God's revelations or to obey the declarations of men? And I want to read out of the little booklet that I'm hoping you'll all get a few copies of. Part of the introduction from actually written by Bruce R. McConkie, when he says, instead of rejecting any portion of what has been revealed, how much better it is to seek for light and truth in revelation, so that going from grace to grace, we might eventually attain the perfect day and have all light, all truth, and inherit eternal exaltation. And I really echo his statement there. I believe that it's a beautiful thing to be able to learn and embrace revelations, especially when you know, as we can with this one, that it does come from a prophet of God, from the Lord. People want to argue about the priesthood and the history of the priesthood, and so I threw up my priesthood lineage here, and you can see some of the things that happened in the story that I told, depicted by little arrows, right? John Taylor and Lauren Woolley and Lorenzo Snow and Joseph Musser are all on this chart because there's multiple ways in which they ordained one another to various offices of apostleship and various authorities. And so the thing that I would like to challenge you about when you think about your priesthood lineage is that most of the time people think of a priesthood lineage as just a who ordained who. And they forget that God is the source of authority. And so when I put this together with all these little arrows, it was to each one has a story about either, yes, an ordination or a commission, but recognizing that God is the source of the authority. And when God gives his revelations, as he did to John Taylor in 1886, God will follow through, right? He says that not one jot nor tittle shall pass from the law, but all shall be fulfilled. When the Lord speaks, he has spoken, and he will perpetuate and serve and give us those blessings so long as we obey his commandments. And that's my testimony. So I would encourage you to read more Revelations, right? The Addendum to the Doctrine and Covenants actually has 8 additional sections that you can add to your Doctrine and Covenants. There's 3 revelations to Joseph Smith, 1 to Brigham Young, 2 to John Taylor, and 2 to Wilford Woodruff that are in here. One of which, of course, is the 1886 revelation that we read today. There's also, I find quite meaningful, a revelation given to Wilford Woodruff, November 24th, 1889, which isn't terribly long before the first manifesto, which really gives me context to understand what he was thinking and doing at that time. If you want to get into more of the detail, the circumstances surrounding the 1886 revelation, We also have a book and an audiobook that you can listen to that talks about exactly how that happened. I've alluded to it in this presentation a bit, that he was in the home of John W. Woolley, one of the men who continued to perform these plural marriages well after the first and second manifestos. But this will give you a much fuller account of the many people who were there and what they thought about being commissioned to perpetuate plural marriage, come what may. So I hope that you will, listen to or download that as well. And so that's my presentation for tonight. And I am hoping for some questions, so don't be shy about throwing a few things in there.
Benjamin, I'm going to share my screen
Okay.
here and bring up the addendum to the Doctrine and Covenants there. Can everybody see that? Can you see that all right?
I can see it.
Okay. And I just wanted to show everybody, when you go to christchurchthebranch.org and you go to learn more and downloads, then that brings you to the page where we've got multiple pamphlets, and the addendum to the Doctrine and Covenants is the third one down. Now, if you keep scrolling down, we also have them in Spanish as well. And if you go a little bit further down, you can also put your information in and have hard copies or paper copies sent to you so that you can have any of those that you would like. And we love a donation because that helps, but it won't stop us from sending it out even if you don't have a donation to give. So we're happy to get these in everybody's hands. And then here's the addendum again. And then today we talked about the 1886 revelation, and it happens to be addendum number 7. And there's the one on Wilford Woodruff just before that. There, 6, and there it is, 7. So, and you can see it's a pretty short revelation, really. Thus saith the Lord revelation that has made the direction of many people's lives different than you would have imagined. And it's a powerful statement when he says, how can I change something that I've said that I would do? How can I abrogate? How could I ever revoke an everlasting covenant?
Wouldn't be very everlasting, right? If it can just get revoked.
Yeah. And so there's a way to access that. We'd love to get a hard copy. In fact, it's great if you do a digital download, certainly, but request the hard copy. That way you can actually put one right in your scriptures. It doesn't take up a lot of space. And then, as the Spirit comes on you and you're like, hey, I feel like I need to read something refreshing from the past, then this will be an opportunity to get some more revelations that aren't even in the Doctrine and Covenants. So, all right. Well, it brings us to a nice end, but Benjamin, I want to pitch it back to you if you have any final words that you want to share.
I'm just really grateful that the LDS Church History Department has made available the original documents of this revelation for us to read now. I really appreciate that move toward transparency too. I mean, I've been a little bit harsh on J. Reuben Clark in this presentation, but it's partly because it creates so much tension and so much difficulty when people can't agree on the facts. Now, I recognize that we're not going to be able to, convert every Mormon to our way of viewing things. But if we can at least both agree that, yes, John Taylor was a prophet and John Taylor received revelations, then at least we're looking at the same set of facts, And I think that gives us the opportunity really to have that free agency. Once we have all the facts, we know and we learn what's been said by the Lord, then we can decide what to do with it. But until we know that the Lord has spoken, it becomes very, very hard for us to truly decide what we're going to do about any of it. And of course, I've come down on the side of, and I want to bear my testimony, that the keys of the priesthood, the fullness of the priesthood have never left the earth. plural marriage never ended in that sense. What happened was is modern Mormonism arose out of a tumultuous and fascinating history of conflict. But there have always been saints who are just keeping on and keeping on. And there are still temples where you can go to receive all of the ordinances that the Lord has for us, including the sealing ceremonies, unchanged, in an unbroken line from Joseph Smith to the present. There's no apostasy in our time that completely stops the work of the Lord, right? There's only the individual apostasy that keeps us from fully realizing those blessings by obedience to all of the Lord's commandments. And so I'm grateful to have found these revelations, and I'm grateful that what it means to me is that the Lord is with us, that he will bear with us through these trying times, and that he will prepare a way for us to fulfill all of his commandments. And I'm just really grateful to know that I can do that. Now, I don't always live up to it, but at least I know that the door is open and that I can approach the Lord with confidence, knowing that he didn't change. He's still there. And so I would like to end that testimony in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. All right. Are all the manifesto copies available is a question that just came up.
Yes, actually. They're not all available on our website. But the B.H. Roberts Foundation, when I made my PowerPoint, I did pull up the original third manifesto. It's available through the B.H. Roberts Foundation online. You can download the full PDF of the original or a transcript of it, because it's kind of hard to read the teeny tiny typeface that they printed it out in. The second manifesto can be found in the Reed Smoot hearing minutes and a couple of other places. Honestly, the third manifesto is the hardest one to find. It's the B.H. Roberts Foundation that makes that most accessible. But the second manifesto can be found lots of places. There's a Wikipedia article on the second manifesto. The first manifesto, of course, is available in any copy of the Doctrine and Covenants printed by the LDS Church after 1933, which is interesting to point out as well, right? The 1890 manifesto was declared in 1890. It wasn't printed so that anyone would have any access to it, besides having been present at the meeting that day with the marshals present and all that sort of thing for them giving that statement. You couldn't have actually read it until about the third manifesto's time period. Further explaining why a lot of church members didn't even know about it, certainly didn't obey it, because it wasn't just broadly ignored, it wasn't even broadly available. People had very little access to even know if there was a manifesto or not. So,
yeah. Another question is, why do you think women were not excommunicated until later?
well, maybe this is a kind of slightly beneficial misogyny. I think what it came down to is that the church didn't want to look like the bad guys. The persecutors, the persecuted didn't want to become the persecutors, at least not at first. And I think that it was really, it's obviously in bad taste to go after these women and try to destroy their lives. When all they've been trying to do is obey the commandments of the Lord, right? It's so much easier to vilify the people who are teaching it or performing the marriages than it was to vilify or go after the families. And so, yeah, I think the main reason was the optics. In fact, the main motive for most of the manifestos was the optics. It was about how this would look. The last thing they wanted to do is look like the bad guys. And so, yeah, I think up until 1933, they weren't willing to do it because they didn't really consider these women to have done anything wrong. The men were embarrassing the church, and that was wrong because they were an embarrassment. But the women were just fulfilling the commandments. And why that double standard? Well, I think that there's some sexism that goes into that, right? But it's also the way it would have looked to the general membership of the church. And that's one of the things that really gave a huge boost to Mormon fundamentalism was when they started excommunicating everyone. They even made a policy at the time that even children could not be baptized if they had a parent who was in a plural marriage. That hard, bright line where they're saying, no, we don't want any of you to associate or be any part of our organization at any level at all that motivated tons of people on the fence to say, oh, well, I guess I'm a Mormon fundamentalist then because I'm not comfortable with this. So maybe it's like the frog in the boiling water that they say. You want to make incremental changes. It's so much less whiplash. It's so much less traumatic for everybody if it happens slowly over a long time period. And by not excommunicating anybody for a long time period, while the number of new plural marriages was in decline, I think they thought, well, this will age out. This problem is diminishing. Maybe it'll go away on its own, rather than us having to do anything about it, and thereby offend the whole church. I mean, honestly, I think if the 1890 manifesto, the first manifesto, had gone down the way a lot of modern Mormons imagine that it did, I think that they wouldn't. I think that they wouldn't have found themselves holding on to even 5% of the church membership. The entire church would have left the church. But by doing it incrementally, they were able to maintain a certain amount of institutional continuity. But if you make all the changes all at once, frog jumps right out of that water, and so would all the members of the church.
Well said. All right. Well, we will let that be the closing statement for tonight.
All
But let's
right.
go ahead and have a closing prayer, and I will ask Elder Keith Peterson to give us a closing prayer if you can unmute and do that.